I think solitude, again, comes up here for me, because without a regular practice of solitude, you're not asking yourself these questions.
Yeah.
You're not asking yourself, what is your perfect life? How much is enough? What are my values? What do I actually require in life to be happy and content? So you end up on this constantly moving train, which you feel you have to be on. You end up in this rat race, which of course contributes to burnout.
Yeah.
And at some point you have to ask yourself, well, what are you working for? What's the point of this? And there's a wider point there for me, Cal, which is, I've been thinking deeply about your book yesterday and today, and this idea of busyness. And I wonder, have you ever thought about whether there's an East v West kind of demarcation here? I mean, you can't really say, specifically East v West, but very generically speaking, I kind of feel in a lot of Western cultures now, UK and US, where we've become quite isolated. We moved away from families. We're trying to do everything by ourselves. A lot of the time, we don't feel that we're of value to people. We're not of value to our communities. So I wonder sometimes, is our over busyness an attempt to feel important, to feel that we are actually of value? Whereas in some Eastern cultures, let's say, very, very broadly speaking, with tighter family units where you feel day to day that you are contributing, that what you do actually matters. Yeah. I wonder if there's less of a drive to fill yourself up with busyness at work when you have that value in other places.
Well, I mean, this is an idea I've been thinking about recently. So I'm sort of beta testing this here. So you can tell me if this makes sense. I think in the West, there's been a major shift over the past 150 years or so when it comes to how do we think about the question of, I sometimes call it the deep life, but building a life that's very intentional, right? Right. Let's say that's the goal. I think this really is a lot of people's goal. I heard a lot about this during the pandemic from people is I want to feel like my life is lived on purpose. It's like sort of quietly remarkable in its own ways. It's like it reflects, like I constructed it and it's cool. It's interesting. It's I'm proud of my life. That's what people want. They don't want aimlessness. So I call this the deep life. It used to be throughout basically all of human history, we saw this as, a lifestyle, I'm going to call it lifestyle-centric approach. What's important, what parts of your life are important, make sure that you're servicing those parts of life. And throughout most of history, this would have been through philosophical or theological ritual and beliefs. You would structure your life, the role of family, the role of spirit, the role of community. It was pretty structured, but it was like, I want to focus on parts of my life that are important to me and live those rights. How I live is what matters. And then we get this sort of shift, 19th century going into the 20th, especially in the West, where that's stripped away, because we sort of had the shift to more of a post-Enlightenment secular culture. And we shifted over to goal-centric planning, which was, how do I make my life good? We said, well, what I'm going to do is take a big swing at something. Like if something really good happens, if my business becomes huge, if I become the number one person doing this, in the wake of that big goal being successful, my life's going to get better. Right. Just as a side effect of doing this one thing, following my passion, getting to the top of the food chain, whatever it is. If I do this one big thing, the rest of my life will fall into place. And this, of course, just doesn't work this way. Like, why would pursuing one big thing to the point of obsession make all these other parts of life that are important suddenly work out well? We know this doesn't work out well for people. And so I think it's like we have to rediscover or transport some of this lifestyle-centric planning, that this was the way, we thought about building the good life until, a proverbial minute ago. Transport some of that to our current age. And we can do it in a more modern, secular way if we want to. But just thinking about, I need to think about all the parts of my life. What do I want those to be? And building my life around sort of satisfying those needs, constructing an ideal life from the ground up, as opposed to hoping that a single goal, if sufficiently bold and brave, will somehow fix everything.
Yeah, I love it. It makes complete sense. Again, something I've been thinking about recently is this idea of our life there are several buckets. There's friends, there's family, there's work, there's personal passions and projects, there's health. And, it may be hard to keep all of the buckets full at the same time. Yeah. But you've got to at least try and at least be aware when you're neglecting one of those buckets, so that neglect doesn't go on for too long.
Yes.
And I think that's the key, isn't it? You know, there are times in our life where actually, you know, we do get a little overwhelmed, and we do have deadlines, and we do have a little bit too much going on. I think we can handle that for short periods of time. It's like acute stress. We are wired for acute stress, but not for the chronic stress.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the way. And also when you're looking at all those buckets at the same time, you begin to find much more creative solutions for the problems of your life, right? So when you're not just trying to maximize one thing and hope everything else follows in its footsteps, you begin to see really interesting configurations where you're like, well, in my work, if I start building up this skill's pretty valuable, but also has a big freelancer potential to it, right? And if I could get to the point where I could freelance this, well, then we could live over here in the countryside, like in the Lake District, because there's this, we want to be quiet. We want to be in the fells. Like we have this other vision of our family life. And well, this would make that possible because this would be remote and it's pretty well paid and it's cheaper to live here. And so we could actually do this. I could do this 10 months out of the year and have 2 months completely off. And then our kids could then learn. And you begin to find these multifaceted solutions where you're like, oh, if I do this, it enables these 3 things, which then supports these things. That's where the really interesting lives come out of. Those lives that when you encounter them, you're like, oh, that's really cool. Like what you're doing is really interesting. You're like writing poetry, but also on like your sheep farm, but a database admin that is like homeschooling your kids as you build up whatever. You get these really interesting, incredibly intentional configurations that are remarkable when you see them, but you can only get there by looking at all the buckets and trying to think, how do I do this?
There was a lovely case study in the book which really spoke to this idea where you have to almost challenge the prevailing cultural norm. I think that's a big theme throughout slow productivity, is that just because this is the way we're doing things, well, it doesn't mean that's the way we have to continue doing things. And was it this computer designer, I don't have his name to hand, where you did this thought experiment. If he was charging $50 an hour and being, do you remember the case?
Yes.
Who was it?
Yeah, so this is from Company of One, Paul Jarvis.
That was it. Yeah. I thought that was great because it reminds me of the parable of the fisherman and the American businessman a little bit, whereby conventionally in our UK and US Western cultures, it's always about how can you achieve more? How can you earn more? How can you scale up? Right? But this guy's doing the opposite of that.
Because when you scale up, you get more ongoing projects, which means more administrative overhead, which means more busyness. Yeah. I love Paul Jarvis's story. So that book, I love that book, Company of One. I blurbed it when it came out.
Did you?
Years ago, right? I love that book. But Paul's story is basically, he was in Canada and Vancouver, sort of expensive apartment in Vancouver, was a web programmer, some sort of technology guy, right? And he was getting better at what he was doing, and there was a demand for his services. And he made this important decision. He said the typical thing to do is to build a business. I'm in demand. If I hired 4 people, we could take on much more work. We could grow this. If it got big enough, maybe I could sell this for, a few $1 million or something like this. Instead, he said, no. If I'm getting better, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to charge more per hour and work less. He went the other way. He's like, why not go that way with getting better? It's like, if I'm comfortable living on this salary now, why not, if I get twice as good, just have my hours? Same amount of money is coming in. Now I have half my time free. And he's like, actually, to me, that's much more valuable than 15 years from now getting a $5 million payday. Like, what if right now I could be working half the week or whatever? So that's what they did. Him and his wife, they moved to Vancouver Island, which is a sort of really sort of rural, naturey place off of Vancouver. And there's a surf break there, and she's a surfer. So they lived in this house in the woods, this sort of modest house in the woods where he had extensive gardens. And he just charged more per hour. They lived cheaply. And he had the life right away that you would imagine, well, this is where I could end up in 25 years if all of this busyness goes well. So I love that mindset, is that as he got good at something, he obsessed over quality, right? Principle 3 of the book. He used the leverage that gave him to take control of his life. He said, great, I'm going to work less.
I think, Cal, if you got someone in a calm state, so they're not stressed out from work, they feel their nervous system relaxed, and you presented to them those 2 options. Right? In 15 years' time, you could sell your business for X million, but the cost of that is going to be 15 years of hard work, stress, late nights, potentially a denigration of your relationship with your friends and your wife and your partner, but you're going to get that 50 million or I don't know, $500,000 payday. What would you rather have? I actually do believe that most people, if they had the space to think about it, would say, you know what? If I was going to earn enough to go on holiday and feed my family and engage in my passions, and I'd have a really good relationship with my wife and my children, I'll take that. But I think the problem is, and again, I keep bringing up solitude because I do agree with you that it's a very, very important foundational activity for every single human.
Yeah.
Without that, you don't have the intentionality to even think about your life. So you end up doing what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
And if you look at that statistic from the start of the show, well, 88% of people are burning out. So do you want to be doing what everyone else is doing in the first place?
Yeah. I mean, I love you emphasizing solitude. And I would add to it, you need more time doing this than you think, probably.
Yeah.
Right. I spend hours on a regular basis alone with my own thoughts, right? Like here's a concrete example. I fly into London, get in, I don't have events that day, get in the afternoon. So I go for a 3-hour walk. I'm staying over by like Parliament and Trafalgar Square. So like, okay, I haven't been to London in a long time and I'm walking for hours, just walking past all the sites, just thinking, right? And so then I'm walking through St. James's Park, which is beautiful. And I come across have you seen this? The Duck Keeper's Cottage.
No.
Oh, it's like a medieval Tudor sort of small, beautiful cottage tucked in on the pond in St. James Park. And because there's these exotic birds in that pond, and I'm sure this was some royal position where like generations lived in this cottage or whatever. And it really resonated with me. It was aesthetically beautiful. It was in a natural environment. You could imagine the kind of the simplicity but meaning of the work of like, this is what I do and I do it really well. And from that random encounter, I got hit by this wave of like, oh, there's something there. And I began to think about writers I know who have like a quiet house somewhere where they go and write. That is like a reflection you get from solitude. And then I'm churning on that. And like, what does that mean? Why is that resonating with me? What is that? I'm not going to become a duck keeper, but what does that tell me about simplicity and aesthetics and a slowness and a purpose? All of those type of insights, which I'm now, I'm processing. It comes from, I'm going to spend time walking, thinking, just taking in the world around me. I have a little field notebook with me, field notes notebook with me. You have to do that a lot to really start to make sense. And so I do it a lot. I also recommend, if we're going to talk solitude, that on your birthday each year, you take like a full day, go hike, like be away from your normal things and really work through your vision for where is my life? What do I want? What do I don't like? What do I do like? What am I going to do in the year ahead to push me closer to what I do like? I do that every year on my birthday. I have a birthday coming up. I'm excited, for it. And in the weeks building up to my birthday, I'm thinking and taking notes. So I'm a huge believer in exactly what you're saying is you have to have time to get your act together. And the thing that's keeping you away from doing that more than anything else is probably your phone.
Yeah. I've never heard that before, to do that on your birthday. I love that. What a lovely idea. What a lovely way of ritualizing your birthday to actually, help you reflect on what that extra year means.
Yeah.
And, the accumulation of another year and where you're going, where are you going to end up if you keep living like this? I think it's a lovely practice that I might try and adopt this August when it's my birthday.
Yeah. Yeah. And also you feel it, especially as, we're mid-age now, you feel the time.
Yeah.
Like that whole year passed. That was a weird year. I felt sort of stuck in that year. It really does help. Like I'm going through some transformations in my life. They're complicated, right? Especially like in my academic role as I move more from pure computer science and over towards digital ethics and thinking about technology and technology's impact. And that transition's complicated. What's happening in my writing career is complicated, right? And I've really been working on this now for years, where it's just hundreds of hours of thought, making sense of what's happened, revising my plans for the future. I mean, a lot of effort goes into intentionally shaping parts of your life. And I have diagrams and pictures that evolve over time. And, it's a lot of time like I'm spending right now at this phase of my life trying to figure out, okay, I knew what my 30s were about. I knew what my 20s were about. I'm figuring out now what my 40s are about. And it's a complicated question and I'm giving it a lot of time.
This is a practical piece of advice. that is relevant for everyone, isn't it? Because whether you're a knowledge worker or not, creating time for solitude is important.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of the time people are so busy, they think, I don't have time for solitude, without realizing that solitude actually will give you so much more of your time back.
Yeah. Yeah. Just don't use your phone for a week. You'll find time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I ran this experiment for digital minimalism where I had all these people stop using their phone more or less for a month. Oh, they had a lot of time. In fact, the problem they had was how much time that generated, and they didn't know what to do with it. That was the biggest problem. And so this experiment I did for that book was 1,600 people. And for a month, we called it optional digital activities. So like you're not on social media, you're not browsing the news, you're not watching video on the news. The biggest issue was what to do with all the time that opened up. So we have time. Also, solitude is easy. It's not, you don't have to go to a meditation room. You don't have to like put aside time. You don't have to go to a gym. You're already going to work in the morning. Just don't put something in your ears. You're already walking the dog. Just like do a dog walk without, reading something on your phone at the same time. I mean, solitude is just about activities you're already doing. Just be doing that activity and let your mind go where it's going to go.
One thing that really, if I can say it, worries me about the state of society at the moment, and it's highly relevant for me because of the age my children are, is technology, smartphones with children.
Yeah.
I was literally speaking to Jonathan Haidt about this last week, and he's obviously done a huge deep dive into the issues here. But when I drop my son at the bus stop, for example, most mornings to go to school, I can remember when I was his age, standing at the bus stop, you'd have to talk to people, right? Even if you didn't know them. And over a period of 5, 6, 7 years of being at secondary school, you kind of figure out how to do it, right? Even if you were nervous at first, you'd figure out like how that actually works. What's going on now? No one's chatting. They're standing there at the bus stop. Everyone's staring at their phones. And I'm not blaming the kids, right? I get how addicted these technologies are.
Yeah.
But it does make me think about, what happens in 20 years or 30 years when these children who are growing up without solitude become adults?
Yeah.
Like, what are the consequences of this?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it makes me nervous. I mean, I'll tell you what gives me some hope though, because I'm really worried about that, right? Because it's difficult to learn how to be a sort of adult socialized human. Like socialization is hard. Our teenage years is when we practiced. I mean, I don't know what your teenage years were like, but also remember parties. You had to walk into this room. You were trying to navigate, like, am I cool enough to be here?
Yeah.
You have nothing you can look at. You have to figure out what's happening. You get really good at socializing. So I am worried what's going to happen if you lose that training. The one thing that makes me a little bit more optimistic is that the university students I teach, and maybe this is just a reflection of the school, it's a pretty elite school, they're pretty good communicators. Like, they're very polished.
Okay.
So I'm like, okay, there's some hope there. Like, maybe they're still picking this up. But I think John's take on technology and kids is right. That he's been very influential. I've known John for a little while. So I've been following along his research over the years, right? And I've given talks at my kids' school about it, where I basically just simulated John on stage. Like, I'm going to show you his charts or whatever. I think he's right that we're shifting, and we'll be there within the next few years, to a cultural mindset that it's roughly 16 or older is the earliest for unrestricted internet access. It's post-puberty is when people should get unrestricted internet access. That's coming really quick now. And I think we're going to look back and say, man, you had a real misfortune if you happened to be born in a time that got you to your adolescent years when we were still in the experimental phase of a new technology, which is, by the way, what we do with all new technologies. When it first comes around, we spend a decade or so, let's just try everything. And then there's the next couple of decades where we figure out, okay, maybe we should have traffic signals on the roads, right? Like, we figure out, like, once the technology comes along, we're just entering the traffic signal phase of kids and smartphones. So, man, if you were a teenager in 2015 or something like this, you just got bad luck, right? I mean, you were like the poor country farmer who got ran over by the first automobile in 1903 because we didn't really know what to do with the technology and people just were driving everywhere.
Well, I know Jonathan says as well, in your view, why after puberty? Why should we wait until after puberty?
Yeah, I mean, a couple things happen. One, your brain has developed more.
Yeah.
Two, you have a much more stable sense of identity. So it's really dangerous when you're trying to build your identity and where you fit into sort of like the world of social structures, to be bombarded by these sources that can manipulate and play on your identities in early adolescence. So by the time you're post-puberty, you're much more stable in your sense of self. Also, your social groups are already more set. So you have a better understanding of here's who I am, here's who my friends are, here's our connections we have to each other. And now you're in your interest. All of this is more baked. And then these things come in. It's not playing with wet clay as much, right? So it can't do as much. A 13-year-old, man, you just get buffeted around because so much is happening at that age.
Well, that's particularly social media, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because as I spoke about with Jonathan, we reluctantly, I did with my wife, get my son a smartphone when he joined secondary school, but there's no social media. And he's really, really good with his use, actually. And again, we take it seriously to model good behavior at home. So we're also not on our phones around them at home and that sort of stuff. So I think that's another piece of it, which we have to take seriously. But yeah, I appreciate your thoughts on that. You still don't have any social media, do you, Cal?
I don't. No.
Yeah.
The people say, I don't think this counts. Our podcast is put out on YouTube.
Yeah.
But it's not my social media. It's not I don't know. I don't understand the world of social media well. The one exception is I do reporting on social media, especially my writing for the New Yorker. It's one of the beats I cover. So I will enter into various social media circles like an anthropologist going to like the distant island. Yeah. So like I'll go on the Twitter for a while to observe certain things to write about, or I'll see what's happening on TikTok so I can write about it. So my understanding of social media comes as a third-party observer. I'm the only third-party observer I think left in the world, at this point.
Well, yeah, it's incredible because most people will say you cannot do what you are doing as a very successful author and not have a social media account.
Yeah,
yet you have proven that's simply not the case. It may be harder for some people, for sure. I get all that, but you've definitely proven that it is possible. I think in digital minimalism, you also made the case that, well, I don't know if it was what you do or you recommended people do, that try not to have any apps on your phone that make money from your attention. Did you say that, or do you still stand by it?
I said that. Yeah. Don't put anything on your phone where someone makes more money the more you look at it, because you're going to lose that battle, right? I mean, look at the capitalization of something like Meta. Its market capitalization is somewhere between $500 to $800 billion, depending on the day. I mean, this is significantly larger than ExxonMobil. That amount of resources, if that's being aimed at getting you to look at your phone more, you're not going to win that battle by just having like some good intentions of I want to look on these things less often. You got to take it off your phone. So yeah, what I recommend is like, okay, if you have some professional reason you need social media, use it like a professional. Have it on your computer in the browser where it's not at all interesting. Have a schedule where you go on there, and I go on there on Fridays, and it's sort of tedious. I post these clips that I filmed on this other day, and I update these things, and then I shut it back down again, right? Because a lot of what happens is someone will have a very narrow, legitimate but very narrow use for a social media tool. Like I need to post like let's use Ryan Holiday as an example. Like he's like, I'm going to post a Stoic quote every day, right? So you'll have this is fine. It's a brand building exercise, but then they'll use that as an excuse. Ryan doesn't do this, but someone who had a reason like that might use that as an excuse to, great, so I have to be on social media all the time.
Yeah.
It's like, no, this is like a very narrow thing you're doing. So don't put it on your phone. That's where all the attention engineering goes, is the mobile apps. The website versions of these things is boring for me. I go onto the computer to post my quote every morning. Like Ryan, I think, has a big Google Doc full of these things, and there's someone on his team. It's like the most mechanical thing. Every morning, copy, paste, send, and that's that. There's no reason to be, there's reasons, but it's trouble. There be dragons. If it's, I want this on my phone and I want to interact with people, or I want to see how well this thing is doing, or it's just mind virus.
You also recently said, which I found absolutely fascinating, that you do use a smartphone, but because you don't have any of those apps on it, it's actually not that exciting.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, it's really eye-opening for a lot of people. We will say that the phone is addictive Perhaps it's not the phone. Perhaps it's what we're putting on the phone.
Yeah. I wrote this New York Times op-ed about this.
Did you?
Where I said we should use our iPhone, our smartphones, the way Steve Jobs intended. Right. And so what I did is I went back and I watched the original keynote address where Steve Jobs introduces the iPhone. I also went and talked to one of the original engineers of the iPhone. They had no notion of the idea that this device was going to be your constant companion. The goal of the iPhone when it was invented was not people will look at this all the time. That if you go to a bus stop or a train, people will be on all the time. If you watch that original keynote, Steve Jobs' intention is super clear. He's like, I don't want you to carry a separate iPod and cell phone. Those should be in the same device. And he thought the interface for smartphones was insulting. He's like, no, you should have visual voicemail. It should be really easy. That's what he was doing. You have to get over 20 minutes into his keynote address before he even mentions other non-music or other non-phone uses. So what Jobs was doing was taking things we already loved, music and communicating, and said, I'm just going to build you a better device for doing it. So that's what the iPhone was. There was not even an app store when it came out.
Wow.
Then later they introduced an app store, and then Facebook really led the charge by realizing like, oh, wait a second, we can get super high engagement on mobile because people have this with them all the time. So if we engineer this thing to be really appealing, we can get exponentially more attention minutes than we've ever gotten before. That's when it became a constant companion. It's not fundamental to the phone.
And perhaps that's why my son, at least up until now, has good habits, because there are no apps on his phone which make money off his time.
Yeah, the original Steve Jobs iPhone is fantastic. Like, what do I do on my iPhone?
Yeah.
I listen to audio, right? It's podcast, audiobooks, music. It's fantastic for that. I don't make a lot of phone calls, but I do a lot of text messaging with my family. And I use the map. And like, I'm very happy to have this thing in my life. I can look up where I'm going. I can listen to things. But the idea that I would just be looking at it all the time, it's just not the way, it's not my relationship with it. Yeah, I blame social media made the phone into a constant companion. Steve Jobs would have thought that was inelegant. He loved music. It's like, I don't want to be looking at this little screen all day. I want people to spend $600 to buy one of these things because it's beautiful and awesome. But then once they have it, I don't need them looking at it all the time. Apple doesn't make more money if you use your phone more often.
That's true.
It's the apps.
Yeah. We have two lives. And the second one begins when we realize we only have one. How do you feel when you hear that quote? So many of us are living our lives on autopilot. It feels like we're on a treadmill and just wasting our life away. In this video, I want to share with you 3 powerful life lessons that have helped me become healthier, happier, calmer, and I feel more in control of my life. So the first lesson is that regret is a form of perfectionism. Now just think about that for a minute. Do you have regrets in your life? And are those regrets helping you? So many of us are consumed with regret. We wish we'd done things differently in the past. We regret the decisions we made. We are consumed with guilt and sometimes shame about the things that have happened. It's not a helpful way to move forward. And I passionately believe that regrets are a form of perfectionism. And I'm going to explain to you why that is. I've had the privilege of talking to a wonderful lady called Bronnie Ware on my podcast. She wrote the book, 5 Regrets of the Dying. And she was a palliative care nurse and spent years caring for people at the end of their lives. And many of them were consumed with regret. And some of the common regrets that people would say to her and say to other people all around the world are things like this. I wish I'd worked less. I wish I spent more time with my friends and family. I wish I'd allowed myself to live my life and not the life that other people expected of me. Right, so we know that regrets are really, really common. And the question is, are regrets helpful? Well, clearly on our deathbed, regrets aren't that helpful, are they? Because it's the end of our life. Right? So we can assume that those people on their deathbeds wish that they had lived their lives in a different way. But what can we learn from that? Well, I think there's plenty we can learn from that, right? If we just think about the regrets I've mentioned and apply them in our own lives, we can go, yeah, you know what? I don't want that to be me. But let's talk about the emotion behind a word like regret. For me, the emotion behind it is one of disappointment, right? It's one of sadness. You see, I think many people who are consumed with regret have this false idea in their heads that they could have been perfect. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this video and want to dive deeper into the topic of sleep, I have created a free special guide containing my top 5 science-backed tips to help you get your best night's sleep and reduce fatigue. If you want to get hold of this free guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below. Right? Is that the belief you have about your life, that you could and should have made perfect decisions? When you look at it like that, it's a bit ridiculous, isn't it? None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes. We continue to make mistakes. But those mistakes can be the best thing that ever happened to us if we learn from those mistakes. So I choose to have the belief in life, and I use those words carefully. I don't need to take that belief, but I think choosing this belief makes you happier and more content. I choose to believe that everyone, including myself, is always doing the best that they can based upon their past life experiences. And I also choose to believe that if I was that other person, I'd be doing the same as them. That's a belief that you can choose to have. You don't have to have it, but I believe it's much more helpful for you and your interactions with other people if you decide to take on that belief. Now, for many years, I've taken on that belief. Right. So if I believe that I am always doing the best that I can based upon my previous life experiences, right? Well, there's nothing to regret. It's a much softer and compassionate way to interact with the world. It doesn't mean that bad things don't happen. No, not at all. It just means that things happen and how we choose to look at them influences the impact that they have on us, right? So this idea that regret is a form of perfectionism, I think it's really helpful because I don't have regrets. It doesn't mean that everything I've done in my life was perfect, not at all. I've made many mistakes, but I don't look back anymore at those mistakes with guilt or disappointment. I accept that that was who I was back then, right? I made certain decisions and I've now learned from those decisions. If I come across similar events now, I will choose to make a different decision. It's very different from people who say, I have no regrets and use it as an excuse just to trample all over people and just keep doing whatever they're doing, irrespective of the outcome. I don't mean that at all. I do live a life of no regrets, but there's a different energy behind it. There's an energy of compassion. It's basically me saying, you know what? Yeah, I have made mistakes, but I can learn from those mistakes. If I could have done better, I would have. But the fact that I didn't means that I couldn't, right? You can constantly keep learning in life. So this life lesson is about being kind to yourself and saying, you know what, I can't be perfect. It's not possible. Perfection doesn't exist. No human being has ever been born who is completely perfect. Even the people we look up to and admire. If you look underneath the surface, there'll be plenty of things that perhaps aren't things that we would also aspire to. That's okay. That's everyone. Right, so this is a powerful life lesson. I think arguably one of the most important ones, because as a doctor, and I've been a doctor now for over 2 decades, a big part of my job is to help people make changes in their life, right? Proactive with their lifestyle, with their choices to make them healthier and happier. And for many people, it's a struggle. And I think one of the reasons it's a struggle is because people beat themselves up. Right? And when you are consumed with guilt and shame, you can never make long-term behavior change. You can do for a few weeks, you can beat yourself up and drive you to change, but over time, you end up back to where you started. But if the energy behind that behavior is one of self-compassion and understanding and forgiveness, that's the energy that's going to mean that that change lasts in the long term. I have seen that time and time again. A couple of years ago, in this studio, the wonderful author Dan Pink came and spoke to me on my podcast, and he wrote a book all about regrets. And we had a great conversation. Dan was saying to me, and the case he makes in his book, is that regret is what makes us human. And he outlined all the different kinds of regrets that we have as humans. He said most people regret things that they haven't done, not things that they did do, which I found really, really interesting. But ultimately, me and Dan were kind of saying the same thing, but with different language. He was saying, use your regrets to learn from the past. And I guess I'm saying that, but in a slightly different way. I think the word regret is tinged with what if. You know, I could have done better. I should have done better. But that's like beating yourself up. You couldn't have done better. If you could have done better, you would have done better. I used to beat myself up. Go, oh, you should have done that. But underlying that was a belief that I could be perfect. That, you know what? When I was 20, when I was 30, when I was 40, I should have been making perfect decisions. But it's not very kind to yourself. It's much more compassionate to look back and go, wow, you know what? With what I knew then, with the stresses that were going on in my life, because of the way I was brought up and the way my parents raised me, I had certain beliefs. And those beliefs led to certain actions. That's okay, right? But over time, we can update our beliefs and therefore our actions. Think about it another way, right? Think back to when you were 18 years old. You thought you were an adult, you knew how the world worked, you knew what you wanted to do. And then just fast forward another 5, 6, maybe 10 years to when you're 28. Did you have the same view on the world? No, I don't think you did. You'd evolved, right? You'd learned. So basically, be kind to yourself, right? You've always been doing the best that you can, right? You might know more now than you did in the past. That's normal. That's what happens. That's how we grow. Embrace that. Right now, a really important point here. I'm not saying don't take any responsibility for things that you've done in the past that perhaps weren't ideal. No. It may be that with the knowledge you have today, that you look back and go, you know what? I actually did make a big mistake when I was 25 and I never took responsibility for it. I was never accountable. For me, a big part of growth is going back and taking responsibility. And it's those learnings that I want you to take and move forward. And a practical idea that might help you apply this life lesson into your life is maybe in the evenings or maybe on a Sunday or a quiet day, you can spend a bit of time with a journal reflecting on a past experience that you're currently regretting and go through it and go, okay, why did you make the choices that you did? What was going on in your life at the time? Why did you have the beliefs that you did? Okay, write it down, but also write down what you can learn from it, right? There's always learnings from everything in life. And we really start to fast track our inner growth, right? When we start to find the learnings. So I want you to write down, as well as what happened and why it happened, I want you to write down what you've learnt from that and how you can apply that in the future if you're faced with a similar situation. Because that's what it's about. It's about living life, embracing our imperfections, but also learning from them, right? Start with something small, maybe something that's happened in the recent past. I don't know, it could be that you're a busy parent and you snapped at one of your kids last week before you left for work, right? And you don't feel good about it now. So you're regretting that decision, right? You're regretting that action. And I get that. No parent wants to be snapping at their kids, right? But write down what was going on then. What was the state of your nervous system? How stressed were you? What was going on at work? What was going on at home? What was the state of your life? Is it understandable that you were slightly overly wired and that you were a bit frazzled? Can you understand why you ended up snapping? Now, of course, you didn't want to do that, right? So the next part of this is to go, okay, what can I learn from that? Well, maybe you got up early that morning and were doing work emails to get ahead and then your kids interrupted you. That's why you snapped. Maybe the learning is, you know what? In the morning is never a good time to do my work because at that time I need to focus on the kids. And if I'm trying to multitask and do work emails at the same time, it's almost inevitable that I'm going to snap at them. It's just a small thing. But if you start to do that regularly, you start to reframe your relationship with your past. You start to reframe your relationship with yourself. You start to understand that you are imperfect, that everyone's imperfect, and that we all make mistakes. But the gold comes, right? And it really is gold. The gold comes when you learn from each of those mistakes. It's not about beating yourself up, because it won't help you in the long term. It won't help you if you're a parent. It won't help you with your kids if you're feeling guilty, right? But it doesn't mean you ignore what happened. You use what happened to learn, and then you apply those learnings in the future. So look, for many people, this idea that regret is a form of perfectionism may be new, right? And I'd love to know what you think. So if you agree, or even if you have a different perspective, please do share it in the comments below. That's important for a couple of reasons. A, I want to know what you think about this, but I think it's also important for other people who are watching this video. It'll be lovely to share your thoughts to help other people learn. Lesson 2, keep one promise to yourself every day. Right? This is really important, right? When you are meeting a new person for the very first time, you're asking yourself 2 questions. Can I trust this person? And can I rely on this person? But you're also asking yourself that question every single day. What do you think your daily actions tell yourself about whether you can or not? I think this is one of the most important things to understand if we want to move forward with our lives. Right? You've got to make a small promise to yourself each day and keep it. How many times do we say we're going to do something? Oh, I'm going to, work out. I'm going to do gratitude every morning. I'm going to meditate every day. And then we don't do it. Now, I get it. Life's busy. We've got a lot of stress, right? There's many things that are competing for our attention. I get that. I'm not having a go at you. I'm simply trying to encourage you to ask yourself, when I say I'm going to do something and I don't do it, what message do I send to myself? You say, I can't trust you and I can't rely on you, right? So the first lesson was about compassion. This is also about compassion because someone who's truly kind to themselves and who likes themselves, and dare I say it, loves themselves, not in a narcissistic way, but in a very healthy and helpful way, they're going to look after themselves, right? They're going to do something each day that nourishes them. And I think this idea of making one small promise to yourself each day and keeping it is much more powerful than people think. People think that in order to change their lives, they have to change everything, right? They have to overhaul their workout regime, their diet, the way that they manage stress, etc., etc. But for most people, that's not really how behavior change works. For most people, you have to start small and build up. That's what all the science and the behavior change research shows us. And that's what my 2 decades of clinical experience working with patients has taught me. So when I say make a small promise to yourself each day and keep it, what I mean is this. All the things out there that you could be doing, from all of them, right? What is one thing that appeals the most? What have you said to yourself before? Was it meditation? Was it gratitude? Was it a 20-minute walk each morning before you go to work? What was it, or what can it be? What is one thing that you can do consistently each day? Now, you could change it up each day, but I think it's much more powerful to choose one thing. If you've seen some of my previous videos here on YouTube, I've shared that I do a 5-minute kitchen workout every day. Basically in my pajamas, while my coffee's brewing for 5 minutes in the morning, I do a 5-minute strength workout. It's just what I do. Now, what's so powerful about that is that every single morning, it sends me a message. Yeah, Rangan, you know what? You are worth making time for. No matter how busy your life is, no matter what the kids have got on or what's going on with my work, I still made 5 minutes to work on my physical strength and my brain, right? Because that's what strength training will do. Yes, it helps you get physically stronger, but it's also good for your mood and your brain and your cognition and your focus. So that's just one thing. It takes me 5 minutes a day. Now, you're already doing one thing, aren't you? You're brushing your teeth, I hope, for 2 minutes in the morning and 2 minutes in the evening. That's 4 minutes a day. That's already ingrained in you, right? You've been doing that hopefully for many, many years. Right? So I want you to choose one thing. It could be simple. It can be you're going to wake up and do 1 minute of deep breathing. Maybe the 3-4-5 breath where you breathe in for 3, hold for 4 and breathe out for 5. Do that once, it takes 12 seconds. Do it 5 times, it takes 1 minute. Really helpful for lowering stress, calming yourself down, improving your focus. But there's many other breathing techniques out there. It could be a 5-minute workout, right? It could be a 1-minute workout, 1 minute of star jumps or jumping jacks. It actually doesn't matter what it is that you choose. The important thing is that you choose something, you say to yourself you're going to do it, and you do it. And I would encourage you, if you struggle with things like this, to make it as small as you can. If it's meditation, can you meditate for 1 minute every morning? Let's say you use an app, right? Could you go onto that app for 1 minute every morning and then get on with your day? You will be surprised, dare I say it, shocked by how quickly your image of yourself starts to change. If you can do that every day for 7 days, let's say a 5-minute workout, or 2 minutes of meditation, or 1 minute of star jumps, right? You start to change the way you view yourself. You suddenly become someone who says they're going to do something and then follows through. You send yourself a powerful message. I can trust you. I can rely on you. I always make time for my 5-minute workout, always. Because it's part of what I do. It's kind of who I am. And that shift in your self-identity, it improves your self-worth, your self-esteem, and that then ripples out into so many other aspects of your life. You're not looking for perfection, right? Like with lesson 1, right? Perfection doesn't exist. Doing the perfect workout, having the perfect lifestyle every day, for most of us just ain't gonna happen. So let's reframe it. We're not looking at perfection, we're looking at what can we do, right? So I really want you to think about that. Make one small promise to yourself, right? And if you want, let me know in the comments what it is. Yes, I want to read it, but I also want this community here that we're building on YouTube. I want them to be inspired. I'm sure some of you have already done this, right? So pop it down. What one small thing do you say you're going to do, and you do? Because I've already mentioned a few ideas in this video. There's many more ideas out there, and you sharing some of your ideas, I think will help people all around the world. So the final life lesson for this video is that busyness does not equal success. I'm going to say that again. Busyness does not equal success. How busy are you? Right? How busy are most of us these days? I think in most countries around the world, most of us are feeling overly busy. Right? The World Health Organization a few years ago said on their website that stress is the health epidemic of the 21st century. Okay. And I think over the last few years, it's got even worse. Right. So busyness is becoming the norm. It never used to be, but it is today. And it's causing all kinds of problems for our health and our happiness. In fact, there was a statistic here in the UK last year that said that 88% of UK workers had experienced some form of burnout in the previous 2 years. Now, it's a truly remarkable statistic, right? Because it kind of says that as a society, we've got something wrong. We've got something massively wrong. Yes, our workplaces and our employers definitely play a role here in terms of what they're asking us to do, the way we're being asked to work. There's many, many factors here that are contributing. But the key life lesson here that I want to share with you guys is that that real understanding that being busy does not mean I'm thriving at life. Right? That's the key message, because many of us do. But for so many of us, business is a distraction from our life. And dare I say it, for some of us, maybe for many of us, business is actually a sign of laziness. Now, I say that with compassion. I completely understand that some people cannot avoid being busy, right? I get that. Let's say you're a single parent and you're having to work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep a roof over your family's head, right? So I understand many people have to be busy. But for many of us also, we don't, but we choose to be because we haven't yet prioritized what is truly important in our life. Remember what I said in the first lesson about regret being a form of perfectionism? I mentioned some of those regrets that people have on their deathbed, that Bronnie Ware, the palliative care nurse, wrote about in her book, The 5 Regrets of the Dying. One of those regrets was, I wish I had worked less. Right? Do you wish right now in your life that you could work less? Of course, not all of us have that luxury. But I think if you start to reframe your life a little bit, you can become less busy. You really can. Now, on my podcast, about 18 months ago or so, I spoke to this wonderful author called Will Storr, and he wrote a book called The Status Game. And when he came on my podcast, he shared with me that status is a universal driver in all humans. Now, when he talks about status, he's not talking about celebrity or money, right? That's not what he means. He defines status in that book as being of value, right? We want to be of value to others. Now, here's one of the uncomfortable truths about the way we're living these days. I think because our communities have separated, because now many of us have moved away from where we grew up, and our networks and our parents and our siblings and our friends, right, the people who've always known us, often we move away for opportunity, for material gain, right? And I get that. I understand why we might want to do that. But I think there's been a cost. Because we don't feel a value to others and the world around us compared to how we used to when we were living in tribes, where we had to be of value. We had to show others that we were contributing in some way. Because we live these isolated lives now where we can work by ourselves on our screen, right? I think that underlying drive for status, the underlying drive of, I'm not of value, I think that drives us to be more busy than we need to be, because we feel when we're being busy that we are of value, we're contributing. And that may be partially true for some people, depending on what your job is. But I think you've really got to understand that busyness does not equal success, right? You're going to have your own definition of what success means to you, right? But I love a weekend where I have nothing to do. I can relax and chill, or at least a Sunday. And I used to work through weekends because the state of the modern world means you can always work in some jobs, right? There's always another email you can send, another task you can get done on your laptop. Those barriers, those boundaries between work and home have been decimated with technology. There's some benefits of that. There's some downsides of that. You know, some of the benefits are we can work from home. Many of us can work from home in a way that we couldn't do. Okay, that is an upside. But you've got to understand that anything in life has upsides and downsides. The upside may be that you can work from home and not have to do the commute into the office. Great. What's the downside? Oh, the downside is you can keep working into the evenings. You can keep working on a Saturday morning and a Saturday evening and a Sunday. So the way busyness has pervaded every aspect of our life, it is toxic. I mean, there are some religions out there, right? In fact, many of the kind of traditional religions around the world have got practices that really encourage people to switch off and not be busy for at least one day a week. Even that can be a start for some people. Maybe in the week, you just got too much going on with your job and your children and your commitments, right? But can you, for 3 or 4 hours on a Sunday, switch off, turn the phone off? And I know families who observe this, and what I've noticed is that a lot of these families are really close because they have a rule in life that means that they're going to switch off. Doesn't matter what the demands of the modern world are. My point of bringing that example up is not to say you should or shouldn't be religious. It's to say there are some helpful practices out there that if we can start implementing, can improve the quality of our life massively, right? And really switching off for one day a week, when I do it, and I do it regularly now because I've learned that I'm much better throughout the week when I have that switch off, it's transformative. You feel completely recharged. We know that resting is critical for your health, your longevity. It's critical to lower your stress levels. And I think that's one of the reasons so many people feel burnt out these days. There's just a low-grade input constantly. I do a few emails here. I get a bit done here. So we never get that complete switch off where our nervous system can reset back down to zero. So, if you can you create some space in your week? I say Sunday because that tends to be, here in the UK at least for most people, the quietest day. But of course, depending on where you live, it could be different. If you can't do a whole day, can you do half a day, 2 hours, even 1 hour? I used to do this when my kids were younger. On a Sunday morning, my wife, myself, and our 2 kids would go out for like half a day without our phones. So we really just spent time together without any distraction. Okay, so that's an idea you might want to consider. Another tool I found to be really helpful when it comes to becoming less busy is almost to flip it. And at the start of each day, I ask myself a really powerful question, okay? What is the most important thing I have to do today? Now, it's a deceptively powerful question because it forces you to prioritize. It forces you to make a decision. And when I first started asking myself that question each day, I would be like, well, I've got quite a few important things to do today. So, I'm going to choose one for my work and one for my home life. And over time, it's become one answer. And again, right? It's not about the perfect answer. That's a theme that's coming in throughout this video in many of these life lessons. Perfection doesn't exist. The point of that question is that you're making a decision, right? Me saying that my work deadline is important doesn't mean that my relationship with my wife or my children is not important, but it gives me focus as to where to direct my attention that day. So each day I'll put down a different answer. Some days it's the same, other days it's different. But it could be, for example, today the most important thing I have to do is go for a 20-minute walk at lunchtime. By setting the intention that morning, it means that I'm much more likely to do it. Now, it doesn't change my workload or the other obligations I have in my life, but it means if I say I'm going to do that in the morning and I complete it, I know that the most important thing got done. It is the antidote to busyness because you feel a sense of completion. I did it. There's always going to be more things to do. Your to-do list will never be done in the 21st century. So having the goal that we're going to get rid of our to-do list, I think makes people more busy because they're constantly trying to firefight. Whereas if you simply say, this is the most important thing I'm going to do today, and you then go and do it, very similar themes to the last life lesson about making a promise and keeping it, right? Just imagine you answer that question every day for 365 days and you do it. That means in a year, on 365 different occasions, what you identified was most important in your life, you did it. Like, you cannot tell me that that is not going to transform your life. There's always going to be stuff you didn't do. But this question, with a laser-like focus, hones down on what is the most important thing on any given day. And as I say, some days it will be, I want to go for a 20-minute walk. Hey guys, I really hope you're finding this useful. If you are and you want more content like it, please do check out my book, Make Change That Lasts, 9 Simple Ways to Break Free from the Habits That Are Holding You Back. It's in all the usual places as a paperback, ebook, and as an audiobook, which I'm narrating. Now, back to the video. Other days it will be, I must make sure I spend 10 minutes with my wife this evening where we're not distracted. On other days it will be, I want to make sure when my kids come home from school that my laptop's down and I'm able to be present with them and listen to what they have to tell me. These are the important things in life, right? And when you pay attention to them and focus on them, before you know it, your life starts to change for the better. You say that forgiveness is a skill that anybody can learn.
Well, I had to learn it, and let me tell you, it did not come easy.
Yeah. So this is interesting, right? It's a skill that anybody can learn. There will be people right now who just heard me say that, who are pushing back.
Of course.
Who are thinking, hey, that may work for some people, but you don't know my life. Okay?
Exactly.
Right. So we'll get to that. But
Can I interrupt you?
Please.
No, the most humorous explanation of things that we have in our little world is we'll go in and give a talk to somebody, to a group, and people will come out and say, almost that's a great talk. However, you never met my ex-husband, or you never met my mother. Mm-hmm. That is the biggest pushback that we have gotten, that you just said. That's great, but you don't get my life.
So let's then talk about, forgiveness. What exactly is it? Because I kind of feel, first of all, I agree with you. I believe it is a skill that anybody can learn. Mm-hmm. But in order to learn that, you first have to understand, what exactly is forgiveness, mm-hmm. and what is it not?
Exactly.
So could you outline that for us?
Sure. I mean, that's a very tough question at some level, because before you mention that the world struggles with things it can't measure, it struggles to define things it can't measure. And so, like, how do you define love, or how do you define beauty, or how do you define forgiveness? It's not so easy, right? So I struggle, as everybody does, with defining these absolutely beautiful aspects of humanity. Right now, the best place that we've gotten to is 2 separate, simple definitions. One is making peace with the word no. Like, no, life will not give you what you want. No, it won't work out. No, you can't get this. And giving up all hope for a better past. Those are the 2 forgiveness things that's as close as I can get, some combination of both.
Mm. I like that. Giving up all hope for better past.
For better past. Simple, lovely. Do you know where that came from? A woman in the Bay Area in New York, not New York, in California. Her daughter was killed, and she struggled for years, and she came up with that definition of forgiveness that helped her cope. And then she made bumper stickers around it, but that was her way of digging herself out of the pain. Was forgiveness is giving up all hope for a better past. It's a very powerful statement.
Very powerful.
Yeah.
At the start of your book, which I couldn't believe you said it was over 20 years ago when it came out.
It's 20 years.
It still feels very, very relevant today.
Thank you.
It's called Forgive for Good. And right at the start, I kind of love this list that you put there, and I appreciate it was written over 20 years ago, so your views and thoughts may have evolved since then. But this is what you put back then. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness is the peace you learn to feel when you allow these circling planes to land.
Yeah.
What are those circling planes?
So we brought some people from Northern Ireland to Stanford a couple of times, each of whom had people killed in their violence. We brought Catholics and Protestants, and they had each either had children killed or other family members killed, and we tried to work with them to forgive. And we were tasked with coming up with a simple metaphor for that, because many of these people they had 8th grade educations, they hadn't been to college. And up until that point, we were teaching at Stanford. So like everybody had a PhD, and it was like a very artificial world. So I tried to come up with a metaphor to explain what forgiveness was. And I thought of this, like when you go to an airport and the air traffic system has planes floating overhead and they land one by one. And if you have a grievance, and that was a pretty serious grievance, your plane doesn't land. It still circles because you're not done. And forgiveness is letting go of the grievance so the plane can land. The plane of this hurt me, or this is terrible, or what an awful thing. Yeah, the plane comes down, lets out its passengers, lets out its grievance, and you're done.
So whilst the plane is up in the air, then, can we extend that metaphor so that we think, okay, whilst that plane hasn't landed, it's going around my body, it's going around my mind, it's causing conflict, it's causing stress.
That's it.
Until you land the plane.
Until you land the plane. And when you don't land a plane on time, like anything else, when you don't grieve a wound and let it go, it disrupts everything. Like it gets in the way. It's like, this plane should have landed 2 days ago and it's still up here. This problem with your brother-in-law or this problem with your neighbor should have been resolved.
And did that metaphor work?
It did.
They got that.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll come back to that, because the Northern Ireland situation of forgiveness is really, really fascinating. But in that list, as you say, you talked about landing the planes. You said that forgiveness is for you and not the offender.
Yes.
Forgiveness is taking back your power. It's taking responsibility for how you feel. It's about your healing and not about the people who hurt you, which I think is really important. You say it's a trainable skill, just like learning to throw a baseball. I think that's really empowering for people.
Well.
It's not that you can either forgive or you can't. Maybe you haven't learnt how to do it. We're definitely going to cover how you do that later on. It gives you control over your feelings, can improve your mental and physical health. Forgiveness is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, these things are really powerful. Do you still stand by all those things today?
Let me tell you, forgiveness is thousands of years old. It hasn't changed in 20 years.
Okay, so I really like that list. And then you say what forgiveness is not.
Let me give you the central piece to that, though.
Yeah.
Let's say you had an abusive parent, and you said you're in your 40s. And you realize it's time to heal, right? The parent could be dead. So you can't wait for them to apologize, to grow, to change. So with that as such an obvious exemplar, the only place forgiveness can be is in us. That we can have been harmed by people who are dead, who have no interest in us. We can be harmed by people who don't even know they hurt us. So that essential separation of offender and offendee is one of the central tenets of this. That I control my experience to what they did. And they may no longer even be available for me to have a talk or a conversation with. Since that's true, you can't have the forgiveness dependent on them.
That's a key point, isn't it?
Yes. It's so challenging for people to let go of a sense that this thing in the past caused me to be unhappy today. That link is called blame. Blame has a good degree of research on how debilitating it is for your physical well-being. It's a position of helplessness. Helplessness is not good for your physical well-being. But when I say, let's say we went to high school together and you stole my girlfriend or something. If I'm still 20 years later, like talking to you as if you're the person who stole my girlfriend, it's not your fault that I've wasted 20 years like that. That's me. That's the crucial thing that is very hard to get across to people.
Yeah. That's why I think people are so resistant to forgiveness a lot of the time. I was watching some talks of yours last night, Fred, and
Thank you.
I think in one of them, you were saying that forgiveness is the prescription that people often don't want to hear about.
Ain't that the truth?
And I think it's because of a fundamental misunderstanding, right? And I think
Yes.
your list of what forgiveness is not really speaks to that. Forgiveness is not condoning unkindness. It is not forgetting that something painful happened. It is not excusing poor behavior. No. I think people often think that if I forgive that person, my ex-girlfriend, my ex-husband, that I am excusing their behavior. And, throughout the book, you make it very, very clear that is not the case. You also say forgiveness does not have to be an otherworldly or religious experience, which is a great thing to make it more accessible. It is not denying or minimizing your hurt.
No.
It does not even mean reconciling with the offender. And it does not mean you give up having feelings.
No. In fact, it's none of those things. One of the things that we recognized over the years, and it was somewhat humbling, is that a large part of what we do is exactly what you're saying. I started to realize after a while that the most important thing that we were doing was explaining what forgiveness is and isn't, and giving people permission to do it. That once you understand what it is and isn't, and somebody says to you, hey, buddy, this is good for you, that's a good deal of what we actually do. The techniques and the processes are less important than that positioning and permission.
Does that mean that the techniques are great, they can be useful, but are you saying that the key thing is to decide that you are a person who is capable of forgiving
and deserving
of forgiving?
Yes. And I mean, so you're here and I'm here for a happiness conference. And one of the challenges of teaching people to be happier is a good number of them have not either made up their minds or had life experiences where they know they deserve to be happier, where that they're capable of right now, right here, right at this moment, I'm worthy. And that is the switch. There's some challenging switch of how it is that people make the decision that they want to be a little happier. With forgiveness, the difficult decision is, do I want to free myself from suffering that started with an offense but has been continued by how I am living my life? The challenge is, one, to let go of that past, but two, to recognize that I'm the one who has been doing, thinking certain thoughts, telling myself certain stories, relating to the world in a certain way that contribute to my suffering, that I took an event, I incompletely grieved it, and then now I have been relating to that event in a way that causes me pain.
Ongoing pain.
Ongoing pain. And every now and then, like, I'll talk to somebody individually, like I more do group stuff. Every now and then, like just the other day, I was on a Zoom with somebody, I think from Italy. And he was talking to me, and the reason he contacted me was, Fred, I got to a point where I just got tired of my own mind. Like, I keep on playing this over. And what we would tell people, or I still tell people, let's say you had literally the worst something. How is it their fault that you can't get them out of your head? How is that their fault? It's your head. And that stops, that question cuts through a lot of the drama that people bring around their wounds.
Yeah. It's that understanding, that deep understanding that the feelings I feel, the thoughts I have, are being generated inside of me.
Now.
Right now.
And I'm practicing how I relate to my own life.
We've mentioned the word control a few times in this conversation, and that sometimes holding on to a grudge is our way of trying to control the future, which of course is uncontrollable.
And the present. So that I don't have to feel vulnerable, scared, small, or lost in the present.
But I guess that word control, if we take it one step further, many of us know that we should try and control the controllables and not control the uncontrollables. Well, one of the ultimate uncontrollables is other people's actions, their words, their behaviors. We can't control that.
Not at all.
So if we say that we are going to be affected for the next 10 years when someone does something I don't like, you're basically saying that I am going to be a passive victim to life.
That's exactly
and
it.
I say that with an open heart.
But that's it.
I'm not blaming anyone. I'm not
It's
calling them. There are really nasty and horrible things that happen in the world.
That's an accurate reporting of reality.
Yeah. Once you get that actually your feelings are your responsibility, you change the trajectory of your life. You understand that the fire that's being lit lives inside of you.
Yeah.
They may have done something one time.
Or 10 times even. It doesn't matter.
But how you're interpreting that is down to you. So
And it's in the present.
So let's take an example. I mean, the book is full of, wonderful examples, but in relationships, in intimate relationships, someone cheating on the other person is pretty common, right? And it's clearly very, very hurtful.
I think they suggest that between 25 and 40% of marriages will have an infidelity.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you must have come across this a lot. People don't want to forgive their partner, their husband, their wife, their ex-partner for cheating on them. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's very, very hurtful. But I mean, if someone came to you and said, listen, I get what you're saying, but my wife lied to me for 12 months and was having an affair, I have every right to feel upset, to be annoyed.
Exactly.
And I'm not going to forgive her.
Right.
What would you say to that person?
It depends when in the process they come to me. So if they come to me 9 months after they discover the affair, I tell them that's not bad thinking. If they come to me 18 months after the affair, I start saying, well, you're creating habit patterns that are probably not going to be in your best interest. And that distinction is enormous.
Okay, hold on. This is really, really interesting. So you're saying that from the amount of people you've seen over time, and for that kind of offense, for want of a better term.
That's a huge offense.
That's a huge offense.
Huge offense.
You're saying 9 months, it's still reasonable to be hurt and upset.
It's not just reasonable, it can be even healthy.
Okay. But at 18 months, not so. So is that because you have a ballpark in your head from your experience?
I do. That there's some research somewhere that I read that most people move through an affair with healthy grieving between 6 months and 2 years of when it happens. Okay. That there's, I do try to keep some research available. So that's the patterning of healthy adaptation. So 9 months is what I can bring my own experience. I had an awful relationship at one point in my life, and knowing enough about this stuff, I gave myself 6 months to complain as much as I wanted to anybody about how badly I was treated. And I was such a pain in the butt, and everybody who met me was, "Hi, Fred. I'm Fred. I had a lousy experience." And I didn't put any limits or governors on my pain or my confusion or my hurt or even my blame. I did that for 6 months, knowing what was going on. And then inside of me, I started to recognize I don't need this anymore. I've complained. I've had pity parties. I've gotten angry. I've had that whole gamut in there. It's not really doing me much good anymore. If I'm not careful, this is going to just be a habit. That was part of it, was inside. The other part was in my head that said, "Fred, well, you know enough. You've dealt with enough people. You got this out of your system now. Now you start talking about the coping narrative. You changed the story. Nothing changed on the past, but you gave yourself a period of time to actively grieve, actively blame, and just be a mess. That was fine. But don't make it your life story." So I shifted to, well, that was awful. Now what do I do about it? Or I better figure out what's next for me. Or I have to learn how to let this go. Or now I need to find out her good qualities, whatever. But I deliberately shifted the focus of the narrative because I know that grieving has anger and despair, but it needs to find acceptance. And so I didn't do it before inside I was ready. You can feel I've bitched about this enough. And now it's either a habit or I don't know what else to do. That's what hits people. I don't know what else to do with this. I only know how to complain or tell everybody how bad it is. I don't know how to shift to, I don't know how to land those planes. So that's what people need massive help with. How do you shift that narrative, and how do you shift that focus from helplessness to coping? That's the intervention point.
I think that the common view in society is that as we get older, our brain function has to decline. What's your view?
I think that it's true that it does on average. And you can see that multiple large population studies show that pretty much every cognitive function that you can measure decreases fairly linearly over time, except for memory about the good old days. The majority of people seem to be able to remember the good old days, but every other, the executive function, short-term memory, all these other functions decline over time. However, I don't think it needs to be that way. Part of what I find to be very interesting about cognitive function and the way we think about it when we age is that there's this story that says, you're born with some like X number of brain cells, and then like every time you maybe drink a little bit too much or you don't sleep, you're killing brain cells, and it's just this inexorable decline that you can't change. And that's not true. We can make new brain cells in some areas of the brain, particularly in some areas of the hippocampus, which is associated with memory. But even then, even if you're not making new cells, the cells you have can make new connections. You can change the structure around those cells in the brain, which is what helps support their function. And you can see that in multiple studies. Even as people get older, you give them a new challenge of some kind, you challenge their brain, and then they'll make new connections. Those areas of the brains will get bigger. You can see it on an MRI scan. So what I find interesting is that just like the muscles of your body, which is easier to think about because you can visibly see it. If you train it, it gets bigger. You can see strength much more easily. But the brain is very similar. If you challenge it and you ask it to do new things, it can adapt pretty much any time in life. So part of it is getting over this thought that, I'm old, my brain doesn't work anymore, there's nothing I can do about it. So stop telling ourselves that story, and then introducing things to ask more of your brain, and then it will function better.
That's really empowering for us to realize that there are actually things that we can do. We're definitely going to get super practical and talk about a lot of those things. You mentioned that there are studies showing that various functions of cognition, various functions of our brain do start to go down with age. These studies that have been done, when have they been done? Because we know that there's a poor level of background health in the population, metabolic health, cognitive health, all kinds of things that generally society is pretty unhealthy now in many ways. So therefore, are we just studying a sick society and seeing cognitive decline go down? Or is it something that's actually an inevitable part of aging, in your view?
So until we get to the point where we can completely stop the aging process, which I think is unlikely to happen anytime soon, function will decline over time in anybody. When you how long that takes and what sort of the ultimate end of that, I think, is modifiable, and very much so. So there is going to be a decline over time, but you can change the trajectory quite dramatically. So that's where you end up. But when you ask about how these studies are done, I guess there's two different ways. One is you do this large population observational study. So you look at the cognitive function in multiple people of different ages. And then you kind of see that across ages, as you look at older people, their cognitive function declines. You can do that in large populations. In a smaller population, you might be able to take the same people and look at their cognitive function over time, or look at their future risk of dementia. And that's been done too. However, when you're studying the population, and in general, these are studies done in modern, westernized, industrialized populations, and we're at a stage where we have to say that those populations are, on average, unhealthy. The vast majority have at least one of the components of metabolic syndrome. They, on average, take one prescription medication, on average have at least one chronic health condition. So we know those various things, that poor systemic health is associated with worse brain health and an increased risk of cognitive decline. So you're right, it's very difficult to study very healthy people and look at what happens to their brains, because there just aren't very many of those people to study anymore.
When we think about cognitive function, a lot of people are thinking about Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
They're thinking about, I don't want to get Alzheimer's when I get older. Maybe they've got a parent or, an auntie or a grandparent. It is affecting many people's lives these days. They're seeing what happens. So I wonder if you could explain, first of all, what is Alzheimer's? And just compare that to cognitive function, because declining cognitive function, so declining brain function as we get older, is not necessarily the same as Alzheimer's, is it?
What we call Alzheimer's disease is essentially two different diseases in my mind. The original Alzheimer's disease, as described by Dr. Alois Alzheimer, is what we would now call early onset or familial Alzheimer's disease is caused by a single mutation in a single gene. There are a few genes that you could have a mutation in. We just need a mutation in one gene that causes early dementia, like 30s or 50s. So third to fifth decade of life, and has sort of like a steady decline and quite rapid.
And that's a huge genetic component.
It's almost all genetic,
okay,
and it's less than 5% of cases of Alzheimer's disease. So it's fairly rare, relatively. What most people think about when they think about Alzheimer's disease is what we might call sporadic or late onset Alzheimer's disease. It maybe occurs in your 60s to 80s or later if you live longer. And it's very heterogeneous. It's very variable from person to person. There's this old adage that says that if you've seen one person with Alzheimer's, you've seen one person with Alzheimer's, because it's like how it expresses itself in different people is very different based on their environment, their genetics, their lifestyle, their general health.
Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying this video and want to dive deeper into the topic of nutrition, I have created a free special guide which contains the 5 most important changes I think we all need to make when it comes to our diet. If you want to get hold of this free guide, all you have to do is click on the link in the description box below.
And that second disease, I don't think is Alzheimer's disease as he originally described it. They're very different, and you can look at them completely separately. So that we might call, or I have called in a paper that I published with a colleague of mine recently, age-related dementia. And it's influenced by all the things that we just mentioned, and we could talk about that more. As you go into that, there is this period of cognitive decline. So clinically, you might call it mild cognitive impairment as a specific diagnosis. And again, it's sort of like the prodromal period before frank dementia sets in. But everything happens on a continuum. So if you look at cognitive function over the lifespan, like I said, it sort of from your 20s or 30s, it on average steadily decreases. So these processes are starting much earlier in life, and that's been described. These processes of the maybe the brain atrophying, starting to lose cells, but also measurable changes in function. Some of these things you can see on scans. It might start very early, but it takes a long period. It takes a long time before you get to the point where your actual function is detectably decreased, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And the way I again liken it to physical function, because again, I think that's something that people can picture more easily. So if you imagine that whatever you're able to lift, say, on a daily basis, shopping bags, things like that, you can probably lift more than that, right? You have this headroom, what you have to do every day versus what you would be capable of doing. However, as function declines, eventually your maximum capacity is what you're able to do every day. And that's what we would call frailty, physical frailty, because you have no capacity for, so say if you stumble, you can't save yourself, right? You're going to fall over. Or if we're thinking about leg strength, your leg strength will decline to a point where getting up from a chair is as much as you can do, right? You have no headroom. And so that's what happens with cognitive frailty or cognitive decline. You just don't have any extra capacity. The brain can't do any more than you're asking of it every day. And eventually you get to the point where the function isn't good enough to do your daily tasks. And then that's when you start to go down into dementia.
Yeah, super helpful and really, really clear. So as we progress this conversation, let's be really clear that when we're talking about, Alzheimer's, we're not talking about the early onset, the classic Alzheimer's. We're mostly going to be talking about age-related dementia. This, I think, is what many people are quite scared about.
Yeah.
Certainly the older people get. And it's not uncommon now in people's 30s or 40s, go, man, I can't remember stuff like I used to, right? So I think everyone is aware of the kind of phenomena we're talking about. Let's say people get a diagnosis in their 60s. When does it actually start in their brain?
So it probably starts right after your brain finishes developing. So after you've built the brain, you've built the connections, you've put down the final parts of white matter in your prefrontal cortex that maybe happen in your 20s or mid-20s, early 30s. that's when the decline starts. So you increase, you build the brain, you increase its function, and then it starts to decline. And I don't mean that in a negative way. That is just when the process starts. And part of that, I think, is driven by societal pressures rather than some process that we have no control over.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is to try and think about what a brain needs to maintain its function, because I'm a neonatal neuroscientist. That's my day job. So I think about, what does it take to build a brain in the first place? And obviously you need, the actual structure. So you need the nutrients and the fats and the things that make up your brain. But you also need the kind of stimulus that it takes to build connections. And so think about babies and toddlers. They're continuously exploring, trying new things, failing, building motor skills, right? Tripping over, trying to stand, trying to climb trees. But they do the same with language. They do the same with social skills. They're constantly pushing themselves, trying new things. And sometimes they fail. But, they laugh it off and they just keep going. And then they do that for a period of time, and then they sleep. They rest and recover. They need that for what we call consolidation in the brain, for that period of plasticity where you're sort of building new connections. Adults don't do that.
Yeah.
We do the same things again and again and again. And part of what I think happens in your 20s and 30s is that you leave formal education. You leave that period of trying new things, learning new things, learning how to drive. All of that's done. And then you become increasingly good at the things that you do every day, which isn't stimulating your brain in the same way.
Yeah.
So I think we can build those things back in. But part of the reason why that decline happens at that period of time is because that's the time when you stop challenging your brain to develop new connections and to maintain the structure that it has.
Yeah, I mean, it's so beautifully simple the way you look at that when you look at kids.
Yeah.
Trying new things, they're failing, they're exploring, they're experimenting, and then they sleep.
Yeah.
Right. So giving it the stimulus, you're giving it that new information so the brain adapts, and then you're resting so it can grow stronger.
Yeah.
And yeah, as adults, certainly as adults in the current society in which we live, we don't tend to do that. It's really interesting, Tommy, as you were talking, and you were saying that cognitive decline, that decline in brain function probably starts somewhere around our early 30s. And before you were talking about how our brain mirrors our muscle, well, we know that from the age of 30, we start to lose lean muscle mass unless we do something about it. So there really is a very strong similarity, isn't there, between muscles and brain?
The more I think about this and look at this from the societal down to the biochemical level, I think they mirror one another almost exactly. And it's the same with almost any tissue in the body. In particular, the thing about muscle tissue in the brain, it's very easy to draw lines across them, which is that the structure and function of a tissue is directly proportional to the demands you put on it, right? The more you challenge your muscle, the more muscle you grow. But in order to grow, you need a period of rest and recovery. And the brain is exactly the same. And you can think about that in terms of building new connections, building new cells, but also processes of repair. So autophagy is this thing that people are really interested in now, where you start to break down the accumulation of damaged proteins and other things within cells. And in muscle tissue, the best thing to do if you want to increase autophagy in muscle tissue is you exercise it, you move it. And it seems that the brain is the same, that stimulating the brain is protective because it upregulates these repair processes. And so that then gives you this framework where you say, well, in order to improve the function and structure of my brain, I need to challenge it. But then I also need to give it everything that it needs in order to adapt to that challenge. So that can be nutrients, it can be sleep and recovery, it can be making sure that there aren't toxins in your environment. Like we know air pollution is linked to an increased risk of dementia, things like that, which then may inhibit your ability to adapt. But the primary driver, in my mind, really seems to be like, how much are we asking of our brains and how much are we allowing it to recover? And that brings in a part of things around health equity, because not everybody gets to sleep. People working multiple jobs with, or lots of family members in a small space, it's very difficult to sleep. Or being chronically exposed to societal stresors, and that chronic stress is probably something that prevents adaptation because you don't get a recovery period. So you can start to see how all the things that we know are linked to an increased risk of dementia may be linked to, first of all, how much are we challenging our brains, and then how are we supporting it in its ability to then adapt to that challenge.
I want to get to the practical things we can do shortly. Earlier today, I spoke to Tim Peake, British astronaut. He spent 6 months on the International Space Station. And there's a couple of things in that conversation that I think really speak to what you have been speaking about. He spoke about the training process. He had 6 years of training. Now, in that training, there's all kinds of things they do. They put them in super uncomfortable situations. They're really trying to build physical resilience, psychological resilience. They take them to cold, dark caves. They deprive them of time. They see what happens when you are under that much pressure. So they're being pushed out of their comfort zone to see how they respond. But he also had to learn Russian. Now, I don't know how old Tim was, but that's interesting based on what you have said, right? Because I'm thinking, yes, he's being trained to be an astronaut. So, teamwork, be resilient, deal with pressure. But actually, a lot of that training is also going to reduce the likelihood that he's going to get age-related dementia. What would you say to that?
I'm sure that's the case. Other than the fact that microgravity or lack of gravity.
I was thinking that as I said the question. Otherwise,
has an interesting effect, at least on muscle tissue. And so how it affects the brain would be an interesting thing. But in general, from his time on Earth, yes, all of those things.
Had he done the training and not gone to space, then that would be excellent brain training.
Yeah.
But again, learning Russian, like we tend to learn languages at school because we have to.
Yeah.
But that new paper you published, which was wonderful, like it's such a good paper, and we'll definitely link to it in the show notes so people can read it themselves. You made a very strong case with your, I think, co-authors.
Yeah.
That a lack of stimulus to our brain may well be causative, so not associated with, but causative of this age-related decline in brain function.
So that's certainly how I read the literature. So I published this paper with Dr. Josh Turkner, who's a neurologist. And it's difficult to really unpick causation in humans to say you've really proven it. And in fact, it's impossible to prove anything in biology. I think that, people need to appreciate that. However, if you look across a broad range of animal studies, human studies, that's really, again, how it looks. And it comes down to how much you're challenging your brain and then supporting your ability to adapt to it. So it's not the only thing, but again, to draw a connection back to muscle tissue, imagine you had the perfect diet and plenty of sleep and strong social connections, all these things that we know are supportive of health. But you didn't do any exercise. You were sort of confined to your bed. And there's been hundreds of studies done on bed rest or immobilizing a limb. If you've broken your ankle and then you put your leg in a cast, when you take that cast off, the muscles on that leg have gotten smaller. Or if you lay in a bed and you don't move, your muscles get smaller. So even if everything else is perfect, if you don't stimulate that tissue, it will reduce in both size and function. And the brain seems to be the same. I think one of the most interesting lines of evidence that supports that idea is based around retirement. There are multiple studies in multiple populations that suggest that the earlier you retire, the earlier you get cognitive decline and dementia. And this is particularly in people who have cognitively stimulating jobs. In fact, then the effect is bigger there. Mm-hmm. And this is after you adjust for, you might retire early because you have a medical condition that's also associated with cognitive decline. This is after you adjust for those things. You see this sort of rapid decline in cognitive function when people retire. And that's because work is the thing that's most cognitively stimulating for most people. And then you remove that and you don't replace it with other stimulus. That's when you start to see that sort of inexorable or sort of faster decline in cognitive function.
So for people listening, right, Tommy, who either have retired themselves or are thinking about their parents, or we have a lot of younger listeners these days who might be thinking about their grandparents, based upon that, they've retired, they've left their job. So what practical advice would you give to them as to how they can sort of make up for that lack of cognitive stimulus?
So what's nice about this is that it seems that there are many different ways to overcome this, all of which are very likely to be effective. So you alluded to one of them, which is learning a language. And learning languages, even late in life, have been shown to improve cognitive function and be protective for certain areas of the brain. Physical movement does it. Resistance, there are randomized controlled trials that show that resistance training improves the structure and function of certain areas of the brain. So just going and starting to lift something if you've never done that before. With respect to movement, it seems that you get more benefit if you do a movement that has some kind of coordination component. So you might think Tai Chi or yoga. One of the modalities that's best researched is dancing. So if you have older adults in their 60s and 70s and you make them do some kind of circuit training at the gym, or the same amount of effort of activity but in a dance class instead, they'll get more cognitive benefit from the dancing. And actually, you can even see that on an MRI scan. Their hippocampus gets bigger more than the other group. And what's nice about something like dancing is that there's a music component, there's a social component, there's a movement component. All of these things we know support health, both physically and mentally.
So all of those things, I understand in isolation would be helpful. Music, social connectivity, very, very good for the brain, physical movement. All these things individually, I think, have benefits, but you chuck all three together and mix them up at the same time, then you're, it's almost like a three-dimensional stimulus for the brain rather than just a one-dimensional one.
Yeah, exactly. And there is some specificity in terms of what are you asking your brain to do versus what does it get better at. So when they've done studies of individuals that did a very challenging learning stimulus, the best example that I know of is taxi drivers who are learning the knowledge in London. So they took three groups, or they ended up with three groups of individuals. So for those who don't know, I guess people don't need to learn the knowledge anymore, but it's 25,000 streets, a six mile radius around Charing Cross station in London. You have to learn to be a taxi driver in London. So it's a huge amount of things you have to, just the memory component is incredible. And it took 2 years. So people they did brain scans before and after. And those who learned the knowledge and passed, they saw an increase in the size and some measures of intensity of connection of the hippocampus, which is the area related to memory in the brain. And these are adults in their 30s and 40s. Those who didn't manage to pass didn't see that. And then also they had a control group where they didn't see any change. So this is specifically in those people who managed to do this huge learning task, saw benefits in that area of the brain. But then they saw a slight decrease in some other aspects of cognitive function because they put so much into memory. So if you really focus on one thing, you become really good at it, but then maybe you've taken away some things from other areas of the brain. It's possible. So if you take something that gives you all of those at the same time, so you mentioned like the social connection, the benefits of physical activity, plus the coordination component, plus music, I think there's multiple aspects of stimulus, so it's multiple parts of the brain, but they seem to come together in a way it's difficult to say if it's true synergy, which is that it's more than the sum of its parts, but definitely seems to be more beneficial than doing any of those things individually.
I can't remember which chapter it is in your book. There's this gorgeous section where you write about, I don't know if she's called Anne, a lady just looking around in her kitchen for candles. But I think you paint two scenarios. One is where the lights have suddenly gone off, she can't see. So of course it makes sense that she's looking and trying to find the matches and the candle to give her light. But you then contrast it with the same situation, but all the lights are on. Mm-hmm. So she doesn't need to do it. There's already light there, but she's probably doing it. Is that right? Am I remembering it correctly?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Our minds, if someone's doing a behavior that doesn't seem to have a purpose, our minds immediately start to think, why? Why is that happening? Because if it's dark and she lights a candle, we're done. We say, oh, that's for light. If it's light and she lights a candle, we say, it's not for light. And then our minds are built so we start circling around. Why would she be doing that? Why would she be doing that? And one of the reasons that we come up with, it must have a deeper purpose or meaning. It's something that we're actually very prone to do as humans, is try to figure out what's going on and attribute meaning to it. And then we say, maybe it's a religious ceremony. Maybe it's a birthday. It must be something other than just light. What is it? Let's pursue.
There's a section in the book which I noted down, right? Because for me, it really spoke to such an important point that I often think is getting missed when we talk about health or happiness. If you don't mind, I just want to read to you a section from your book. Is it always a mistake to fail to execute on your good habits? Or is the experience of savoring a decadent dessert simply a different kind of success? Michael, I love that. I absolutely love that. Can you explain what you meant when you wrote those words?
I thought about a person. I mean, let me say I am very pro habit. I wish I had better habits. We all should have good, healthy habits, just to be very, very clear. At the same time, if I think about, imagine starting today, you had perfect habits for the next 40 years. You know, you got up at the same time every day, you exercised, you did everything exactly as you wanted to do. If you ask people, what kind of life would that be? They say, well, I would definitely be very healthy, for sure, but I'm not sure that would have been a rich and interesting life. Or if you ask people, imagine being married to someone who has completely rigid habits that they execute the same way every single day forever. Does that sound like a fun relationship, or does that sound like a problem? And people say, yeah, no, I guess they'd be healthy, but I want to mix it up. I want to travel. I want to do all these other different things. And so it really started to occur to me that for sure good habits are good, but is that the life that we want to lead more broadly? If we look back at our life, do we say, I'm so happy that I always ran at 6 a.m., or do we say, I'm so happy I had a range and variety of experiences in my life? And I do think sometimes rituals are the thing that remind us to do more than just habits. And that's true both of our own private rituals that we come up with, but even cultural rituals you can think about. It just gets to be every day is the same. We do the thing, we go to work, we just humdrum over and over. Culture gives us punctuated things. They say, not today. Today is Christmas. And on Christmas, you do something very, very different. For example, you have to gather with family on Christmas, whether you like it or not. But they're telling us family is important. You got to take some time for it. So that day, maybe we can't do all of our habits exactly the way we usually do. But I think that's a positive thing. So both culturally, we get these punctuations to remind us. If you think of marriage, you have a wedding, that's one day, and then you're married for 50 years. What do you do all the other days? Well, we have Valentine's Day. We have anniversaries. We punctuate them with, hey, don't forget, this person's really important to you. You should celebrate this relationship. They do serve as reminders to do more than just go through the motion. We have this phrase, going through the motions, and it's a very negative phrase. Rituals are always more than just going through the motions.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that. I mean, I think the point about this phrase that really speaks to me is I think sometimes with science, we have reduced things down so much and we draw conclusions that aren't actually that relevant in real life some of the time. And I'll explain what I mean by that. So we could, for example, look at all of the blue zones, these areas around the world where people are living to a ripe old age, apparently in really good health and, with high levels of happiness as well. And Dan Buettner will write about this in his books about that. These guys drink coffee. They have probably a glass of wine every evening in some of them. And then so often the conclusion is, I would say in the West, is that, coffee is good for you then because of that. There are lots of correlation studies showing some benefits of coffee consumption. However, I really feel that if you're overly stressed and you're overly committed and you're drinking coffee to keep you going so you can keep up with that workload, I'm just not sure that the research on the blue zones is relevant for you. Like your nervous system is fried. You're in a completely different state. You're not using it as a way of bonding. It's not necessarily a ritual for you. You're literally grabbing it as you run to the train. You're just going, yeah, get me a latte takeaway. And again, no judgment of people doing that, but it's not the same thing, right? If you're drinking alcohol to numb your loneliness at night by yourself, it's not the same thing as in the blue zones where you're doing it at 5 p.m. in community and when it's just half a glass. There is something about the meaning of what we do that is so relevant to the impact it has on us.
I completely agree. I think about this a lot. I mean, there's this phrase, the Mediterranean diet, and what we take from that is the diet part. But it could be the Mediterranean that's causing I think we do try to boil it down into some actionable steps that we can take in our lives. And as you said, those can be really beneficial, and often the science supports that as well. But it doesn't mean that's the whole thing that's happening. I used to study how people could spend their money to be happier. And one of the things that we've found very robustly is that you tend to be happier when you spend money on other people than when you spend it on yourself. Not every single time, but on average, spending on others makes you happier than yourself. And that could be giving to charity. It could be giving to a homeless person. It could be buying a gift for a friend, treating your mom to lunch, whatever it might be, just outward instead of inward. And of course, it's not really the money that's the thing. It's the intention that you have. You use the money to enact the intention, but what really matters is, and we show this in the research, you feel like you're having a positive impact on somebody else in the world. You don't need money to do that, right? So it's not that you should take your bank account and start divvying it up into 25, and do all this kind of stuff. It's that the intention really matters. And so even with the research that we've done, sometimes the practical advice, it's true, but there's a larger thing surrounding it, which is, do you have meaning in your life? Are you having an impact on the people you care about? Or are you just focused on yourself all the time?
Yeah. It also makes you think about there's a cost to everything we do. I think I spoke about this about 6 months ago on one of my podcasts, but this idea that there's only so much time that you have in your day. And yes, you could argue, and it's not you could argue, it is true that physical activity is exceptionally good for your short-term and long-term health. Sure. But so are relationships. And so in your limited time, if you're going off for a 2-hour walk by yourself, you also have to factor in, well, what else are you not doing in that time? Maybe it's time with your kids. Maybe it's time with your wife or your husband or your partner. And yeah, for me, it's always about looking at these things holistically and taking a 360-degree approach. So yeah, thank you for sharing that.
We had a project a few years ago that we were calling The Curse of Counting, and in the domain of well-being. And the idea was that we'd like to feel that we're making progress in life. And sometimes that's very hard to know if we're making progress in life. So we use things that we can count, because then we can say it's more or less. So salary is a great example. If I'm making more money, then I'm probably doing better than I was before. Step counts are a great one. If I'm taking more steps, that's better than taking fewer steps. So these things that we can measure, we really start to rely on them because of course we're human. We want to know where we stand. But a lot of the most important things, and you just reminded me of this, are you a good dad? There's no metric, there's no scale where it's 1 to 10 and your kids have a knob and they rate you every day and you can track your progress. It's just something that has to matter to you or not. And you could say, well, I'll increase the hours I spend with my kids. I'll count them. That's not it either, right? It's not about the amount of time you spend. It's what you're bringing to it when you are with your kids. And I do get concerned, actually, that when we measure things, we start to focus on the measured ones instead. And those can be really, really important. I mean, steps are good, like exercise is good, as you said. But what about the fuzzier things that we don't have good metrics on? Do we lose sight of them because we can't measure them instead of thinking, actually, I really need to invest in that?
100%. I'm so on board with you. And I would say I'm now starting to prioritize the unmeasurables. I realize now that a weekend with no work, if I'm able to, with my wife and kids, and we go out for walks and have meals together, I can't measure that in any way, but the feeling it gives me is just, it's like nothing else.
Yeah, we don't have words almost. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I've from having made mistakes in the past, I'm now very clear on a few things that whenever I'm weighing up a new offer, engagement, speaking, whatever it might be, I'm always going, okay, that's the upside. What's the downside?
Yeah.
And because most things have got a downside as well. We're very good at looking at the upside. So yeah, fascinating. Let's get back to this idea that rituals are subjective, or I think they are at least. How do you then as a scientist go about trying to study rituals?
It's very annoying and frustrating.
Okay, fine.
Is the short answer. In part because, as you said, two people can be doing the exact same thing. And for one of them, it's a meaningful ritual. And for the other person, they couldn't care less. So even with something like religious services, for example, if I'm taking a bird's eye view, I'm Irish Catholic. So imagine I'm watching a Catholic Mass. Everyone's doing the exact same thing at the exact same time. You know, they're kneeling when they're supposed to and standing when they're supposed to and singing when they're supposed to and talking when they're supposed to. You know, so everyone understands. For some people in that church, what they are doing is an incredibly deep expression of their faith. It's connecting them to their parents, to their grandparents, to their shared history. Other people are there because their parents made them. And I can't tell who's who by looking. They're doing the exact same thing. It appears to be that they're engaged in this kind of ritualistic behavior. The only way I can really know is if I ask people straight up, hey, what were you doing in there? And some people will say, I was practicing my faith and feeling this connection to a higher power. And other people will say, I was literally counting the minutes until we could leave because I wanted to go play football.
Yeah.
And so we have to actually get these subjective impressions from people in order to understand, is what you're doing more than just the actions, or is it just the actions? And what was particularly frustrating is you could imagine that what we would find is that if you clap 3 times and stomp 10 times, that's a ritual. But 2 claps and 11 stomps is not. You know, so we can actually figure out these are the motions that make it a ritual, and these are the ones that make it not a ritual. And there may be some sequence of actions that works for everybody, but we never have seen that. In other words, it's not that the specific actions are the ones that are the key. It's actions that you have imbued with more meaning. If you imbue brushing your teeth and showering with more meaning, other people do not, like you. If you imbue your coffee with more meaning because it connects you to things, that works for you as well. But the only way to know, are you just drinking coffee or are you enacting something, is for me to say, hey, how were you feeling when you were drinking that coffee?
Yeah. There's this idea, isn't there, in your book about rituals are a way of turning ordinary events into extraordinary moments. And you give a really beautiful example, I think, of 2 couples and their Saturday shopping. Perhaps you could explain that.
It's very sad. So we
one of them was very sad,
yes,
actually. Yeah,
we did this research. Jimena Garcia Rada was the lead author. She studies decision making in couples, which in and of itself is just an incredibly fascinating topic.
Yeah, for sure.
We worked together on this research on rituals in romantic couples. And if you ask couples, you know, is there anything you do? We usually don't say, do you have a ritual? Because people think people in robes with candles. So we say, is there anything you do that's special to you, that has meaning for you, that you make sure to do every day or every week or every so often? And people say yes or no, and then they tell us about them. And what we see is most couples have something like that, usually between 2/3 and 3/4. But when we ask people, so what I can do is I can interview you and ask you about it, and then I can interview your spouse separately, so they can't hear what you said and ask them about it. And what we find is very often both people agree. They say, yes, we do have something like that. And they tell us about the same one. A smaller number of people say, no, we don't have one. But at least they agree. They both say, no, we don't have anything like that. But the very sad couples are the one where we ask one person and they say, oh my God, yes, we have this wonderful thing, you know, that we do every week. It's very special. And here's why. And we go to the other room and ask the other person and they say, no, we don't have anything. Those are ones where there's a mismatch. And we see even on something like shopping on the weekend, we see some couples who say, you know, every Saturday morning we go to the market and we explore together. You know, we explore new foods, we explore new cuisines. We're foodies, so we love to do that together and then bring it home and cook together. And it's a really important part of our weekend. And other couples say, yeah, we got to go to the market every weekend to get food. And there's nothing.
And it's a pain.
Nothing else in it at all. And so technically, again, if we look at them, They're both going to the market to buy food. But for one couple, it's this amazing expression of their bond. And for the other couple, it's just nothing at all. And again, the saddest are one person says, oh, we go to the market and we're foodies and we express our. The other person says, yeah, I guess we go to the market. I don't know.
Yeah. It's not the what, it's the how.
And the agreement is so critical, right? That we both are in this together. We both see those actions as more than just actions.
Since you started studying rituals, is there anything you learned that you wish you knew sooner?
I think actually, so when I started studying, I mean, as you know, I am a scientist from Harvard, so I'm supposed to be very objective and things like that. And when I started studying rituals, I had a sense that they were very ubiquitous in human life. And I kind of knew they were in my life too, because, that's birthday parties and things like that I was doing. But I really didn't think that I was a ritual person. I wouldn't have said like, I'm the kind of person who's into that. And speaking of the chaos of the morning when you have kids, so the moment when it really hit me was when my wife and I had our daughter 8 years ago now. When you have a kid, if you've ever had a kid, what happens is you go to the hospital, and then a little while after that, they give you a baby and they say, go away and take care of it forever. It's a very, very stressful moment in life. And so what do parents do? I mean, it's about as chaotic and stressful as you can have in your life. And so what parents do, and we did it too, but I didn't realize it until in retrospect, was we bring rituals to bear almost immediately, just intuitively. It's not in a book or anything like that, but we start to do things like when you ever talk to a couple with new, it's like, is the baby sleeping? Are you sleeping? Who's sleeping? When are they sleeping? That's the conversation about it. And what parents do is they develop rituals around sleep almost instantaneously. It's, and it's this book and then this song, and then we do the bath, and then these two songs, and then we do the swaddle, and then it's these songs in this book and with this person, and then that, and then these 3 stuffed animals. I mean, it's a very, very elaborate sequence of events in order to try to get the kid to sleep. And we did that, but I didn't know I was doing it at the time until later it suddenly hit me talking to parents. All parents develop their own special sleep ritual for their kid. And I think what was so important for me that even after that realization was that it wasn't that it was necessarily helping her. It might have been, but it might not have been. In other words, we didn't try 12 different rituals and figure out which one was the best. We just ended up with one that seemed to work. And I think what it was is it was helping us, not so much helping her.
Giving you a sense of control.
Exactly. And that I think was such an insight, which is sometimes we're doing a ritual for a seeming purpose, but in fact, it might be helping us in a completely different way. Yeah. And that started to pop up in more places that I had never thought of until I got into the research.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It also, to me, speaks to this idea that we're now creating rituals that maybe we didn't need to before because of the way culture has changed. And if I think about that specific example, the nuclear family is quite a modern invention, really. The way many people now live, certainly in Western countries, is not the way that we've ever raised kids for years. It's always been in groups. There's been a community, a tribe, there's been a family there. So I guess maybe 100 years ago, baby's born and the grandma is providing that wisdom and insight as to this is what you do. Do you know what I mean? All those things are there. But now, because for many people that's been lost because their parents live miles away or they've moved for opportunity, for work, actually, it is chaos. And if you don't know what you should be doing, you're going to create something to give you that sense of control, aren't you?
Completely. And it is one of the hardest shifts that we make in our life. And there are people who are really expert at it. There's like doctors and nurses and people who've had kids before and grandparents, all of these people. And we remove all of them from the environment. We just say, let's have 2 rookies without any support at all. Just try to figure this out. I mean, we rarely do that in life where we say, here's something that's very, very important. Let's get a couple of novices on it and see what they can do instead of get an expert in the room who says, that's not how, do it like this instead. What are you doing?
I like the way you call yourself a ritual skeptic. You write about that in the book as well, that you approach this. You started off as a skeptic and now you're a full-on believer, if I can say it.
Getting there.
Getting there. You mentioned the sleep routine with your daughter. I'm interested as to what else might have changed in your life. You've studied rituals for many years now. You've written this wonderful book on them. Do you think that writing that book or even just studying this subject area has changed anything about the way you go about your day-to-day life? Have you started to introduce rituals to things that previously were just routines?
For sure. I think in two domains. One is for sure at home, and the other is at work. I think we have this lab group that we call Nerd Lab because we're nerds and it's a lab group. We're not that creative on the naming, but it's professors and PhD students and postdocs who we all work together. And in the lab, we always had kind of unstated norms about what we valued in the lab and what was important in the lab. But after I started studying rituals, I started really thinking about more, what are the key things that make this group different from other groups and make it distinct? And one of the things that was so important was to really value ideas for their own sake, not because they would work or because they're practical or because they have any basis in reality, but just value creativity and ideas. And so started thinking about implementing rituals in a sense to try to make sure that we were enacting that value that was so important. So we literally have something that's called random ideas, where every so often we just come in and you have to have random ideas. And you're not allowed to study them. In other words, you may not study your random idea. You just have to bring it as an idea. We do things like, if you just take Beatles songs, you can say, come up with a research project based on a Beatles song. And they're all like really, really great. Like Can't Buy Me Love. I mean, any Beatles song is a fantastic social science project right there. We're not going to do the project, right? But it's this idea of instituting this practice that really shows over time what we care about here is ideas, and no idea is bad because we're just trying to pull ideas. And instead of just vaguely valuing that, creating practices actually that make sure we bring that to bear.
Yeah, again, this idea that rituals are about meaning. So you're talking about values in your lab and how can you ensure that those values are upheld? So I guess it could be like every Wednesday lunchtime, for example, we're having random ideas hour or whatever, or something like that to ensure that value is being acted upon.
For sure. I mean, you go to any organization and they all have different mission statements, but they're all the same in the end, underlying it a little bit. And the question is not, and it's things like, inclusivity and innovation and words like this that are really important and valuable. But what are the practices being put into place to actually bring those values to bear? You have to actually institute not just the words, but what are really you going to do day to day or every Wednesday in order to surface those values.
So that means, I guess, that there has to be a practical component to rituals?
I think you do. In other words, you have to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The actions are just the actions. So you could do whatever you want in any meeting, but you need to bring this set of actions together in order to live out that value.
But I guess because it's subjective, let's say there's 10 people in the lab, right? Let's say 5 people are coming going, this is great because this is what we value. And so, I can't wait for a random idea Wednesday lunchtime again because that's my favorite part of the week or whatever. But the other 5 might be, man, I didn't join this lab for this. What a drag.
Exactly.
Right. So again, that could mean that for 50% of the lab, that is a ritual. But for the other 50%, it's more a routine. Is that fair to say?
Almost a distraction, even more than just a routine. Like, why don't we get to the science instead of doing this random idea thing? And in fact, that's such an important point because when you have these practices that enact values, they help people sort. You can say, oh, this is not the research group for me, or this is not the company for me, because these practices that everyone around me seems to value very highly, they don't resonate with me at all. That's not what I'm looking for. And we do see even over time in our own research community, people will filter in, try it. And some of them will say, oh my God, this is what I've been looking for. And other people will say, I don't know why we're doing this Beatles song stuff. We got to get to work. And they'll go to a different lab group. And so they are, and we should talk about rituals can be very connecting and binding, but they can also cause difference and division because the way that we do it is the way that we do it, and we'd like other people to join in, or we start to get a little suspicious of them.
Yeah, especially within relationships, I guess, you know. So if you enjoyed that video and found the content useful, just stick around for a moment because I think you're really going to enjoy this one as well. In this video, I'm going to share with you what I believe the core ingredients of happiness are and show you how you can work on them and get better at them.